Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing why care about childcare. I'm Jamie Paglia, Program Manager of the Forum. This year, Cambridge Forum is celebrating its 35th anniversary of bringing you live public programs for the discussion of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. As professional aspirations and economic challenges have brought more parents into the workplace, the need for early child care has dramatically increased. With the transformation of traditional family structures, greater numbers of single parents, women in particular, have found themselves in the position of being both sole parent and provider. Does the lack of social supports place undue burdens on parents and young children? What impact does early child care have on children, their relationships and development? Are those costs too high? For the past 12 years, Kathleen McCartney has served as a principal investigator of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development's study of child care and youth development. Tracking 1,350 children from birth through age 7, the study aims to examine the effects of early child care. Currently a professor at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education, Kathleen McCartney was previously director of the University of New Hampshire Child Study and Development Center. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Kathleen McCartney.
Thank you. Child care is now an ordinary part of life for American children, and here is the evidence. 79% of children under 3 years of age regularly spend time in child care. 39% of children are in care for 35 or more hours per week. And 81% of kindergartners begin school after having been in child care. These statistics represent a dramatic change in how American families raise our children. Despite the fact that over 3/4 of American families with young children depend on child care, we share a profound ambivalence about our reliance on it. On the one hand, we seem to think that child care is all right, even beneficial for economically disadvantaged families. Consider our welfare reform policies that require mothers of young children to work, or the strong bipartisan support of programs like Head Start. On the other hand, when it comes to middle-class children, we view child care at best as a necessary evil. We worry that it disrupts the mother-child bond and that it leads to a plethora of bad outcomes, from language delay to aggression. Parenting experts, social scientists, the media, and even politicians fuel these worries. When asked about the school shootings at Columbine High School, House Majority Leader Tom DeLay said that guns have little or nothing to do with juvenile violence. Instead, he blamed school shootings on daycare, the teaching of evolution, and working mothers who take birth control pills. No wonder Americans are ambivalent. And here is an illustrative personal anecdote I can't resist sharing with you. When my daughter Caitlin graduated from high school with honors, my mother mused, and to think she was in daycare. The irony of this story is that my mother herself provided Caitlin's child care for her first 3 years of life. The other irony, as you know, is that I have spent the past 20 years studying the effects of child care. What are the effects? The answer to this question, like most questions about children's development, is it depends. Child care is not a uniform experience. A child care setting can take a number of forms, including the child's own home, a neighbor's home, or a child care center. This means, of course, that the people caring for children can include relatives, nannies, family home care providers, and center-based teachers. These people vary in their knowledge about children, they vary in their ability to provide caregiving, and they vary in the enjoyment of the work they do. Consequently, children's experiences vary. As a researcher, I have seen childcare at its worst and at its best. I have observed in childcare settings where they're caregivers and watch soap operas and the children wander around aimlessly. And I've been in settings where adults and children alike seem to muddle through the day without much of a plan. But I've also been in settings where the staffs have dazzled me with their creativity, with their patience, and with their dedication. Of course it depends. Research on the effects of child care began to appear in scholarly journals in the 1970s. The timing of the research is important. During these times, women were entering the workforce in increasing numbers, and parents were deciding to place young children in childcare, even babies. This was new. Sensibly, social scientists wondered how young children were doing. By the mid-1980s, a controversy erupted among scholars that made its way to hometown newspapers. Some developmental psychologists worried that early, extensive care during infancy was bad for babies. Although the research was not at all consistent, some studies linked early care with insecure attachment relationships and later behavior problems. Because the stakes are so high for American families, the director of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development issued a request for proposals to study the effects of child care. 10 investigators, of which I am one, were funded to direct a collaborative study of 1,350 children, the most extensive study of child care and its consequences that has ever been conducted. We began the study in 1991 when the children were 1 month of age. Currently, the children are in 4th and 5th grade. From our observations of these children in their homes, in their child care settings, and now in their schools, we've learned a great deal. I will summarize for you now 3 of the most important questions we have answered. The first 2 address the fears that launched the investigation in the first place. First, does child care disrupt the mother-child relationship? The short answer is no. To measure children's attachment relationships with their mothers, we observed mother-child separations and reunions. Children are typically stressed by these kinds of separations, but when they have secure relationships, they're easily soothed by their mothers during reunions. Then we asked a series of questions about child care. If children were younger when they went into care, were they more affected by the separations? Did the type of child care the children experienced, the number of hours they were in child care, or the quality of care affect children's experiences of separations and reunions? What we found was that none of these factors influenced children's security with their mothers. Instead, the quality of the children's relationship with their mothers predicted security. The less sensitive the mother was to her child's need, the poorer the relationship. How sensible. Nevertheless, it's important to note that child care can add to the risk of insensitive mothering. In our study, children in low-quality child care who also had insensitive mothers were at greatest risk for developing insecure attachment relationships. But child care in and of itself did not pose a risk for the mother-child bond. Second question, is the amount of time children spend in care related to behavior problems? The short answer is maybe. Last April, we released some findings that documented an association between hours in care and teachers' ratings of behavior problems. The more hours, the more problems. To measure behavior problems, we asked caregivers as well as mothers how often their children were disobedient, hit others, had temper tantrums, and so on. We found that 17% of preschoolers who had spent lots of hours in childcare had above average levels of behavior problems. But interestingly, this is exactly the proportion we see in the population at large. In other words, if you were to randomly select a group of preschoolers from the general population, some in childcare and some not, 17% of them would have above average levels of behavior problems. Thus, it's tempting to conclude that childcare does not pose a risk. But when you look at a different set of children, preschoolers in our study with little experience in childcare, only 5% had above average levels of behavior problems, and that figure is significantly lower than 17%. From this perspective, childcare seems to pose a risk. The important question, though, is why hours in childcare might be associated with bad behavior. What happens or doesn't happen when children are in care? Is it exposure to peers? After all, you can't hit others if no others are there. Or are children in child care merely more assertive? We're working on the answers to these questions right now so that parents can make informed decisions about their children's care. For now, all we can say is that we've discovered a provocative finding. But because these results created a media brouhaha that alarmed parents, I feel compelled to add an important caveat. The vast majority of children in child care did not have behavior problems. So it really does depend. I just don't know what it depends on yet. Third, does quality of child care matter? The short answer is absolutely. Our findings, which replicated those of smaller studies, showed that children who experienced higher quality child care, especially those in center-based care, performed better on school readiness and language tests than other children. Interestingly, children in exclusive maternal care did not perform any better, or any worse, by the way, than children in child care on cognitive and language tests. Based on these findings, we know that quality child care settings have smaller group sizes, lower child-adult ratios, better educated teachers, and more experienced teachers. Although we cannot regulate caregiving per se, we can and do regulate group sizes, ratios, education, and training. But regulations vary greatly across states. For example, in Massachusetts, the ratio of adult to infants must be 3 to 1. Sorry, I said that backwards. Infants to adults must be 3 to 1, while in Idaho, it can be 12 to 1. Imagine for a minute that you're an infant caregiver. The infants in your classroom need to be fed when they're hungry, comforted when they're crying, engaged when they're ready to learn, socialized when they misbehave, and left alone when they need downtime. Where do you think you could do a better job, Massachusetts or Idaho? 39% of the settings we observed in met our standards for quality care. This means, of course, that 61% of children in our study were in low-quality child care. Child care, especially quality child care, is expensive. The cost of high-quality infant care in Cambridge can cost as much as $1,700 per month. Estimates for the costs of quality care across the country run from $4,000 to $10,000 per year. What is worrisome to me is that the children most at risk are also the most likely to be in poor quality child care. The reason for this is simple. Poor and working-class families cannot afford to buy high-quality child care for their children. Even middle-class families would struggle with tuition bills of $1,700 per month. And woe to those families with 2 or more children under 5 years of age. Unlike most other industrialized countries, the United States does not think child care is much of a public responsibility. Sonia Michel, a historian, argues that the remarkable growth of the new right was derived in part from its opposition to universal child care in the early 1970s. Currently, federal supports for child care are modest. There's a dependent care tax credit that amounts to about $480 per year. Other supports for child care are mostly indirect. Low-income families may receive help in the form of Head Start, although only half of eligible 3-year-olds receive services. And low-income families may also receive subsidies from a program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, commonly referred to as welfare reform. Unfortunately, these subsidies are short-lived, and they're often not enough to buy quality care. States also receive child care and development block grant funds that are used to fund a variety of programs, including teacher training. Here's the bottom line. The government pays 100% of the costs of primary and secondary education, 73% of the costs of higher education, and I have a feeling that figure might surprise you, but only 39% of the costs of child care. The reason our child care system works at all is that it is essentially subsidized by teachers, the vast majority of whom are grossly underpaid. And I think we might have some here tonight. In 1998, child care teachers made an average of $14,820, and most received no benefits. Because salaries for early childhood personnel are so terrible, it is difficult to attract and retain good staff. A fourth question that our study does not address, but that I would like to pose to all of you is, should child care be a greater public concern? Most social scientists who study child care, like me, seem to think so. Economists Suzanne Helburn and Barbara Bergman argue that there are 3 reasons childcare should be a public responsibility. First, and quite simply, they assert that young children deserve a quality of life that promotes their happiness, security, and self-worth. In other words, children deserve to have a good day. Their next 2 arguments pertain to the effects of childcare on children and parents. With respect to children, they argue, as I have, that high-quality childcare prepares children to be future citizens of this country, while low-quality childcare does not. With respect to parents, they argue that low-quality care negatively impacts worker productivity and thereby employers' costs of production. These are compelling arguments to some. Why, then, is our childcare system so underfunded? My best guess is that the lack of support reflects our culture's concerns about maternal employment in and of itself, as well as concerns about the costs of large federal social programs. In contrast, most industrialized countries have decided that childcare is indeed a public responsibility. For example, some of the best childcare centers in the world can be found in Reggio Emilia, a town in northern Italy. Interestingly, parents in Reggio Emilia worry about children who are not in childcare. They think childcare has positive effects, even for babies. Why? Parents and teachers believe that children profit from learning alongside other children and in the care of early childhood educators. The curriculum is continuously evolving and reflects the interests of the children in the moment. As a consequence, children produce remarkable work that has amazed American educators like me. And the teachers see themselves as researchers as well as caregivers. They carefully document the children's project work, and they reflect together on children's progress. How do they do it in Reggio Emilia? There's a line item on the town budget for early care and education. They have adequate economic resources, and for this reason, they can both recruit educated teachers and offer affordable programs. So why care about child care? I've offered 3 arguments this evening. First, child care is a normative experience for American children, and it is here to stay. Second, research has shown again and again that children profit from high-quality child care. And third, our child care system is broken. Hopefully, public awareness will help lead to needed solutions. And for this reason, I thank you for the opportunity to present my thoughts on child care to you today.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Kathleen McCartney discussing why care about child care. In regards to the Reggio Emilia method and the cultural approach that they have in Italy and in that particular region, can you sort of look at our cultural attitudes in contrast to theirs? How is it that they have managed to create this network of teachers and students and families and parents that are all working for the same social good? And we we consider ourselves one of the most forward-thinking industrialized nations in the world, leaders on so many other planes, are so far behind.
Well, I'll make an attempt to answer that, but really you probably ought to have an anthropologist here instead of a developmental psychologist. There are lots of differences between our culture and their culture. I mean, for one thing, they're socialist in orientation, and so for that reason, it's not surprising to me that they have this belief that that children really need to be raised, not exactly collectively, but that everybody in the community takes responsibility for raising children. And, we have a very different economy, a capitalist economy. We have different ideas about the rights of individuals and families versus the right of the greater social order. So I think that's part of it. Their interest in childcare began after the Second World War, and it did correspond to women entering the labor force. And I think they just sensibly decided that there needed to be supports for families. So that's the short answer.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Kathleen McCartney discussing why care about child care. The floor is now open for your questions and comments. Please do use the microphone.
Hi. I have a question. I don't know if you've studied the creme de la creme schools, a very didactic form of teaching academics where homework starts at 3 years old. And I'm just wondering if you have studied that kind of preschool, if you can tell about the difference between that and Reggio, and why Reggio is better than a didactic form of teaching.
Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't studied children in those centers per se, so I can't talk about those schools. What we did in the NICHD study is that we followed children into whatever child care setting they found themselves in. So if they were being cared for by grandmothers, we went to grandmothers' homes. If they had a nanny in their own home, we observed there. If they were in a center, and it might be either a national chain center or a non-for-profit center, we went there. So I think what we have in our study are a range of experiences. So I can't comment on what's better or what's worse with respect to specific kind of programming, because really what we focused on in our study is caregiving. What we did was we followed children really for 2 mornings, for about 6 hours. And we simply noted what kind of caregiving they were receiving and what their interactions were with peers. So we had our clipboard, and there were specific behaviors that we were looking in. And with respect to their interactions with their caregivers, really looking to make sure that there was a lot of it and that it was sensitive. So that if a baby was picking up a ball and trying to say the word ball, there would be a caregiver answering the child saying, yes, that's right, you have a ball, don't you? Or that kind of responsivity was what we were looking for. With respect to Reggio Emilia, the curriculum that they use, and I'll just call it the project approach, has been written about by a number of early childhood curriculum scholars in the United States. There are people, Americans, who have gone there, looked at it, and really brought it back to their early childhood community here in the United States. So that if you were to go to a meeting of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, there would be sort of meeting after meeting about, quote unquote, the Reggio approach or the project approach. And I think American excitement about the approach stems from the fact that children tend to produce remarkable artwork, remarkable stories, remarkable collaborative projects. So the influence of Reggio Emilia on American education is, I think, now, fairly widespread. We're doing it here too.
I actually have 2 questions, and they're not related at all, so I'll ask the first one. It's a follow-up. I was fascinated by your description of how you conducted your study at the early ages. How have you followed up as the children are now in 3rd and 4th grade, you said? Mm-hmm. How do you follow up? I would be curious to hear that. And my other question is a policy-oriented question. Do you have any idea what is going through the minds of the policymakers who, on the one hand, are reforming welfare and urging low-income women to go to work, don't stay home and take care of your children, but on the other hand are wishing that middle-class, upper-middle-class women would stay home and not send their children to daycare, who are blaming, as you pointed out, Columbine and every other ill of society on the fact that we have working mothers.
Okay. Well, the first question was really about the nuts and bolts of the study, so I'll answer that one first. We began recruiting families into this study, believe it or not, the day that children were born. We were in hospitals. We were in about 30 hospitals across 10 different research sites. And because it's not really fair within 24 hours of giving birth to recruit mothers, we gave them a brochure about the study and asked them if we could call in a month. And then in a month we did the real recruiting. So we went into the field in January of 1991, and at 1 month, when the children were 1 month of age, we were in about 1,350 homes, mostly asking mothers questions, questions about their background and questions about the baby's temperament and questions about their own levels of depression, those kinds of questionnaires. At 6 months, we started assessments on the children in earnest. At 6 months, we observed in the homes, and we had our videotape equipment and more questionnaires, but we were doing lots of observations of mother-child interaction, and we also observed in the child care settings. When the children were 15 months of age, we added a third assessment. We brought the mothers and the babies into our laboratories, and that's where we did things like this separation and reunion procedure, which is what our field uses to measure attachment. We also administered an infant intelligence battery. And at 24 months, we did the same thing. We were in their homes, we were in their child care settings, and they were in our labs. At 36 months, the same thing. At 4.5 years, the same thing. In kindergarten, we polled their teachers. In first grade, we added a school environment observation that was analogous to the one we did in the child care setting, and again, we were in their homes, and again, they came to our labs. We've seen them in 3rd grade, in 4th grade, and now in 5th grade. We're currently in the middle of the 5th grade assessment, and we hope we'll be able to get funding actually to study them even further, not only because many of us are interested in the long-term effects of child care, but also because the study has evolved such that it's really a natural history study of childhood, so that other people are using our data, which are available to other investigators, to study problems like maternal depression, for example. Or I have a postdoctoral fellow right now who just published a paper on the effects of poverty. It has nothing to do with childcare, but it's a really exciting paper. So that's the answer to the first question, and I should add that my colleagues and I are very grateful to these 1,350 families who have welcomed us so graciously into their homes and into their lives for the past 11 years. Second question is about the minds of policymakers, and let me say there, too, that it depends there. I mean, there really are some legislators like Senator Kennedy in this state who have been working tirelessly to improve early care and education for young children. But as for the differences that I think are reflected in our culture about poor families and middle-class families, that's just class politics. I think you see that, almost in any debate that impacts children and families, and it's a sad thing, because what's good for middle-class families should also be good for poor families, and vice versa. So I can't explain it.
I'm curious how the care providers reacted to your being there. You would think it's like I have a daughter who is in early child care. Sometimes that is much to my chagrin, but she does have good care providers. But I definitely feel like they are probably more attentive when I'm in the room or when I show up unexpectedly. Is there a factor for that in the study, or do you think that
well,
how were you in the room, I suppose?
Yes. Well, whenever you're doing participant observation research, people's behavior changes. There's just no question about that. So when we're in people's homes, their behavior changes too. I mean, presumably people are more or less on their best behavior. And probably to some extent that's the same phenomenon applies to people working in child care. But what you see regardless is still a normal distribution from not very good to mediocre to great. So what you do is your presence shifts the whole distribution towards something better, but you still see a range of behaviors. So that when we're in homes, we see harsh parenting. We even see the occasional, slap on the bottom. I mean, maybe some parents prevent themselves from doing that, but we see a range of behaviors and it's not all good. And the same when we're in child care centers. We see a range of behaviors. We saw some harsh caregiving where, children, one of the hardest ones to observe was a caregiver reprimanding a baby, really, who was having a bad day and crying and needed a diaper change and had a nose that was running, and the caregiver was more or less just telling the 6-month-old, what a lot of trouble she was causing her. That's hard to watch. If we saw anything that was reportable, we're ethically bound to report it, so that if we saw child abuse, and we did, we saw it in homes, not in child care centers, we did report it. That happened several times at several of the sites, including my site in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm.
I do have 2 questions. My first question is how many states was your study done in? And my second question is related to the fact that it's hard to keep child care providers. I am a teacher at a daycare center in the area, Soldier Fields Park Children's Center at the Harvard Business School. And I'm paid pretty well, but I've been at the center for 14 years. So, but getting new teachers to come and be there is very hard. And, the problem is child care is expensive, and yet you have to try to find people to give good child care.
Right.
And what's your thoughts on that?
Okay. First question. When the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development issued its request for applications, what happens is that people like me wrote grant proposals. So most of the child care researchers across the country wrote grant proposals, and they funded 10 of us. So the proposals were awarded on the basis of the merits of the grant and not actually to represent the country geographically or anything like that. We represent 9 states, so it's not bad. So 2 of the principal investigators were in Pennsylvania. We have an investigator at Temple and one at University of Pittsburgh. So that's the answer. We did have a methodologist consulting with us so that we could have as representative a sample as possible. So we made sure that we had enough low-income families and enough families where both parents were planning to return to work. We had to make sure we were doing that because, after all, we were planning to study child care. The question about retaining qualified staff is really a hard one. Lots of times, for example, I'm asked to work on social policy initiative aimed at teacher training. Let's just train the teachers and then we'll have a good workforce. The problem is you get caregivers trained and then they leave. They decide to go work in a bank or where they're going to make more money. Parking lot attendants make more money than child care providers. So until we tackle the problem of teacher compensation, I don't really see a solution to the child care crisis. And when people talk about the resource base for child care, what they say is we need a third party. Right now there are 2 parties. There are the parents who pay, and there are the child care providers who also pay by virtue of their low wages. The parents can't afford to pay much more. The child care providers certainly can't afford to make any less. Now, as I mentioned, the government does subsidize child care to some extent, but it's really a quite limited extent. And it's a problem without a solution unless there's some third-party involvement. Sometimes advocates talk about employers helping. Employers currently subsidize about 1% of child care costs. And Harvard, for example, subsidizes child care costs for its employees. I mean, they probably provide the space and the utilities where you are or subsidize them. That would be a typical university partnership. And it helps, but it isn't enough.
I'll make a couple comments. I can never pass up the chance to comment when someone says parents can't afford to pay. I think that's one of the ways in which we sort of stop ourselves and assume that there's a limit there. I think parents afford to pay for many goods and services that they want in their life, and that the people who provide those goods and services charge what they consider to be a fair price and a necessary price. And when the cost of my car goes up, I don't have much choice. When the cost of my house goes up, if I want it, I pay the market rate. So I think it's very easy for us to get into that slogan that says parents can't afford to pay, but I think it's self-defeating to sort of stay that. So I would kind of push that aside. But let me take a different question if I could, and I hope it's not too naive, but are we sort of barking up the wrong tree here? And, maybe childcare is not a good thing to do. Maybe it's not really the way we should take care of children. It's, in effect, an artifact of either economic or social choices where people decide both of the parents have to go to work and have to be out of their house. Why is that a good thing for young children? Is that desirable? If we had our druthers and we could create a system any way we wanted to, would it be that we ship 7 infants off to one room together with a bunch of underpaid, unmotivated teachers and hope for the best? Why as alternatives, aren't there other sort of family policies that we have? Why can't mothers and fathers stay home, be with children, and put children first in that sense? That we're not. I don't know how much we think about this, or if it's a luxury to even think about it. Maybe things sort of move along too far and you can't really do that. But every once in a while I think about it when I think of the challenges of trying to work with groups of young children, maybe older preschoolers are a different thing, but younger children. You think, it's a real struggle, and it's really unusual to have so many children together. I remember someone who mentioned at one point, we generally, as human beings, we don't have litters. We don't have 7, 8, 9, 10 children all of the same age together. We have a mixed age grouping. We have a variety of ages, but our child care programs are fairly typically age grouped, and so we have lots of people like that. So just in thinking of other kinds of social policies, family leave policies, shared work situations, support for families to do other things than to go both think that, gee, now we have a child, can I get back to work in 6 weeks? And, that's what's important in my life, is getting back to work rather than my child. I think this is a real fundamental social question here that society really wants to talk about.
Do you have a question also to follow? You had mentioned that you wanted to.
Well, I can.
That's just. It's a idealistic comment I'm throwing out just to. Partly I throw it out because it's so difficult to get good child care.
Right.
And, maybe there's a different resistance or a different level of resistance if you go the other way. It just seems like so utopian to think that there would be great child care, given the kinds of choices we have in our society, and wonder, are there other balances that might be equally well to explore?
Okay. Well, you have said many provocative things, and I'll just reply to some of them. The first is that really there are many parents who can't afford the cost of child care. Maybe not middle class families, but there are many families in this country who can't. And there are economists who have proposed plans where there would be sort of a sliding scale, so that we wouldn't have this kind of social inequity, so that families who can't afford to buy child care are forced to use unregulated care, or forced to use maybe a variety of placements, like their child might be with one person on Tuesday and a different person on Tuesday and Wednesday. And those kinds of split arrangements probably aren't very good for children. So there's sort of that. I think there might be solutions short of universal child care that really would be affordable and something for us to think about as a nation. The other thing I want to respond to is to think about what's natural with respect to caring for young children, because I think we assume that the nuclear family is natural and that the stay-at-home mother or father is natural, but really that particular configuration is pretty new in the long evolution of human history. Humans have always lived in social groups, and before the Industrial Revolution, women and men worked alongside their partners. Usually their work was at home, so they might be involved in farming, for example. So while women were working alongside their partners, where were the children? Typically, children were cared for by relatives who were either too young to be productive workers or too old to be productive workers. So they were either older siblings or grandmothers. And, often it would be the case that an older sibling might have in her care, 2 or 3 other children. And I think it's important to remember that these this sort of romanticization of motherhood is really post-industrial revolution and relatively new, but it's so embedded in our culture that we really can't think beyond it. And that's one of the reasons I like to talk about Reggio Emilia. Believe me, if you lived in Reggio Emilia and you were pregnant and you signed your child up for child care and they ran out of space, you would be in a panic that your child would be at risk. Now, would your child really be at risk? I doubt it. Is your child at risk if your child is in child care in this country? No, and I think I've presented research to show that. So finally, it's really a question of values. And if there's one thing I've learned about child development in the past 20 years, it's that children are pretty resilient and that they thrive under a variety of caregiving arrangements as long as they're with people who are invested in them. And child care workers are sometimes among the most invested people that I've ever had the opportunity to observe. Before I joined the faculty at Harvard, I was a professor at the University of New Hampshire, and while I was there, I was the director of the Child Study and Development Center, which is what they call a laboratory school. And by laboratory school, I mean it exists to train future teachers. So this particular center was a pretty large one, about 140 children and a staff of 20 full-time employed teachers, and then just a host of students coming in and out and in and out. And I'm telling you, those teachers fell in love with those children, and the parents relied on their teachers for advice about all kinds of things, from how to talk to children about death to how to prepare a child for the birth of a younger sibling. So it can work, is the bottom line.
You mentioned the bonding of the child to its mother. As a result of going through early childhood, or shall we say child care. What about the father? What bonding to the father, does that equally get attended to? And then my concern would be with the teachers that are in the daycare centers. Mm-hmm. Are there any males in there? Mm-hmm. Not many, I suspect, from what you said about the salaries. But maybe we see something different at Reggio. Do they have males within that environment?
There are very few males who are early childhood educators, either here or in Europe. And again, I'm not sure why that's the case, but there certainly are some fields that tend to be gendered. And the younger the child, the more gendered it is. So if you went to an elementary school, you would see mostly female teachers. You go to a high school, and you see more male teachers. With respect to attachment to fathers, fair question. We didn't look at it because of funding, but also because it wasn't a question that people were asking. And the reason that people weren't asking it is that fathers have always worked and have not had primary responsibility for early child rearing, and I think you will agree with me, have developed secure attachment relationships with their children. I mean, that's something that we observe just by being fellow human beings on the planet. But if we had had more funds, and we did have generous funds, but I think that would have been an important thing to look at. I would also have liked to have looked at children's attachment relationships with their caregivers. But, we had some constraints in the kinds of questions we were able to look at. And truly, the question that launched this study was whether or not the mother-child bond was at risk because of infant daycare.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention about males and early childhood. At the center that I am at, we don't have any males right now. We have had in the past, over the years I've been there, 3 different males. All 3 were wonderful with the children. The children love males. They love to have male volunteers, male student teachers, male teachers, if you can find them. But again, it's because of the economics that they don't do it. But I just wanted to share that they do exist and they are very good.
Yep,
when you find them.
Yeah, we've certainly seen them, but I think it's less than 1% of what the data nationwide show. The other thing we know about salaries is that higher salaries predict higher quality care. And I think there's a reason for that. I mean, better qualified staff assort themselves to places where they're paid more. But it's an empirical question whether or not we could recruit a more talented pool if the salaries were better. I suspect that we could.
Since someone raised the question, are there positive aspects to child care experience in the long term? Maybe you could talk a little more about what you have seen in the Reggio schools as opposed to the families that are in Europe, that were there, that did not have their kids in the Reggio schools. What was the sort of long-term development of those kids?
Can you restate that question?
Yes. In regards to the long-term positive effects of child care centers, if you could talk about the Reggio Emilia schools and what you saw there.
Well, I want to tell you a funny story about Italians versus Americans. When I visited Reggio Emilia, I met a professor of early childhood education named Susanna Montavani. And she asked me, why I was there and what I was doing. And I told her, well, I'm, one of the investigators on this NICHD study of early child care, and we're looking at, the effects of child care, and I, proudly told her about the study. And she looked very bored, and she said, oh, the American question. And I said, what do you mean, the American question? And she said, the effects of this, the effects of that. And I said, well, what's the Italian question? And she said, the Italian question is, how do you make child care the best that you can be? And that's what they do. They don't do effects of this, effects of that, outcome-based research. It really is, apparently, a very American enterprise. That's what we do. So if you were to ask them, does it work? Does the curriculum work? They would say to you, the proof is in the pudding. And they would take out a portfolio of a child's work and show it to you and say, there you go. That's what they would do. So I can't answer your question as one American to another because they don't have data showing that their children are better prepared for schools or that they have higher language scores or that they're more collaborative. That's the way that we approach the enterprise rather than saying, are children having a good day? What do our children's portfolios look like? Etc. We do outcome-based developmental science, and of course that's what I do. And I do see some utility in the American question. I don't want to lead you to believe otherwise, but I think they have a good question too. Just how do we make it the best we can be? I mean, they value it for what it is.
Could you talk more about the project-based approach?
Yeah, I would love to talk about the project-based approach, but I'm going to talk about it at the University of New Hampshire. When I went over there, I went with Mary Jane Moran, and together we were co-directing this University of New Hampshire school. And Mary Jane was really the brains of the operation. She is the curriculum expert, and she was the one teaching the courses on curriculum. So on the plane back, she said, I'm just going to change the way I do everything. And she did. Instead of having individual teachers in training, doing individual projects, she had teams of teachers doing projects. And instead of having teachers bring a project into the classroom that they were interested in, the projects evolved based on the children's interests. Now, we used to joke at UNH that the only problem about this is that you'd always be doing a project about worms in the 2-year-old room because that's what 2-year-olds were most interested in, at least at UNH, where the Child Study and Development Center was next to the agricultural farms. So she began to do everything totally differently. We placed incentives for the staffs who had been there forever, and forever in the fall had been doing the falling leaves and harvest time and apple picking. Now suddenly we're studying what the children were interested in. And let me give you an example. One time, a mother who had adopted a girl from China brought in some information about the Chinese Moon Festival. And she just wanted to share that because her daughter was excited about it, and so was she. Well, this led to a substantive interest in the moon on the part of the 4-year-olds. So they had a regularly scheduled trip to the library, and they got books out about the moon. Well, that's great. And then one of the teachers noticed that the next morning when she put out clay, they were making moon rocks. Well, she saved the moon rocks. And one of the parents said, do you know, I think the president of UNH, whose name is Joanne Lightsell, I think she has a moon rock. Well, as it turns out, it was a meteorite, but the children wrote her beautiful letters asking if they could go see her moon rock, and they illustrated them, and they laminated it, and they bound it, and I think President Lightsell was delighted to get their invitation, so of course there was a field trip to go see the meteorite. At the same time, happily, John Glenn took a trip up on the space shuttle, which the children watched. Then they decided, well, they wanted to go to the moon. So they built a spaceship, and you can guess the rest. The bottom line is, for about a month, the children, the teachers, and their parents were talking about nothing but the moon. And all aspects of the curriculum were involved. There was literacy, there was art, there was math, there was dramatic play. And it didn't have to be the falling leaves just because it was October. And I could give you example of countless projects like that. I mean, I will just give a few. One mother was teaching her child sign language. I mean, neither the mother nor the child was deaf. The mother just thought that this would be a fun thing to do. And so this child was, signing more when the child wanted more snack, etc. Well, the next thing you know, every single baby's signing more and signing boring and signing all kinds of things. So the babies even did a project on sign language. And I guess I already told you about the 2-year-olds and worms, but lots and lots of worms.
So it seems like the Reggio approach, I know that we're focusing the talk a lot on that, and that wasn't necessarily my intention, but that there is, from the outset, there is a respect for the child's interests, and listening to it. It's more of a journey with child and teacher instead of a teacher just talking at the child. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I also think that's part of what Americans call developmentally appropriate practice. I mean, the National Association for the Education of Young Children produces beautiful curriculum materials that Americans have used for years. And there's a book on, what it means to provide developmentally appropriate practice. And certainly respect is a big part of that. I mean, being responsive to children is a big part of that. And it's not as if American educators never did projects that were emergent from children's interests. They certainly happened. But the Reggio project work is exceptional, I think, because of the way that teachers approach it. And they have a museum exhibit that really consists of the children's work. So I think they've been sort of better at promoting the children's work as art, if you will, and the teachers, who after all are documenting the children's work and explaining what it means as part of the beautiful displays that the Reggio teams have produced.
You said that your study did not focus on the father-child bond. I wonder if it focused on sibling relationships and the impact that child care may have had on sibling relationships. And I also wonder about a different problem of childhood, and that is the regimentation and the overscheduling of children in this society, and whether early childhood daycare has any relationship there.
With respect to siblings and fathers, we got smarter as the study went along, and we do have some whole family interaction tasks and some father-child interaction tasks that were really quite engaging to our families when the children are older. You'll have to invite me back once we've analyzed the data so that I can tell you about those. And your second question was about what? Oh, regimentation. Well, I think, again, that if early care is developmentally appropriate, you wouldn't find that. There certainly are parents who I think overschedule their children, and that happens more as children get older. But you're even seeing it in the preschool years, where there might be, gymnastic classes and music classes and art classes, as well as childcare and so on and so forth. And I think you're right that that's something that we need to be concerned about. One of the things I'm concerned about with respect to early childhood education is that there may actually be an influx of federal government funds because there's an interest in this administration on, reading and preparing children, to be readers on the first day of school. And that, kind of curriculum approach, I think, could even be dangerous, even though finally there might be this influx of funds. So I think you raise a good point. I mean, there are a lot of books written about how preschoolers learn by lots of theoreticians, and all of them stress play. I mean, that truly is how children learn best, by experimenting with objects in their environment. I mean, if you watch sort of a one-year-old at play, the one-year-old's going to be picking things up and looking at it and shaking it and putting it in his or her mouth and rolling it around and exploring the properties of the object. That's how children learn. And, as they get older, I think they learn from one another, too. And that's an area in which, childcare really can be a good thing for children.
I'd like to make a comment about the group experience. I happened to be in Montreal with my daughter, and we saw a group of little kids who were probably 3.5 coming along on a rope. And my daughter said, "Oh, Mum, isn't that really cute?" She was fascinated. And I said, "Yeah." I said, "It's interesting." I said, "But at that age, when you were that age, you were up that step, you were under that tree, and I was able to be communicating with you." And I said, I think that one of the dangers of the group activity is you cannot give attention to the child, to the teachable moment, to the time when you need to pay attention to what's going on. And in my own hometown, which happens to be Vancouver, BC, last week, I saw a young dad with his little kid in the back lane, and I stood for a minute and watched him. And I said, it does my heart good to see somebody really focused on this little fellow who spent maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes messing about with 6 stones. I don't think you can provide that well enough in a group situation unless you pay real attention to the environment the children are in, not the curriculum, but the environment, the nuts and bolts of the ground. And my passion is that it has to be right for kids, and much of it needs to be outside for kids, not inside.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I agree with everything that you said. I don't think I would think it was cute to see children on a rope at all. I think I'd be horrified. And I think one of your points really in terms of attention really harkens back to the point about ratios and group sizes. I mean, the ratios have to be good enough so that those teachable moments can be capitalized upon. I absolutely agree with you about that. And I also agree with you about the focus. There are other studies of child care quality that have approached the assessment of quality different than from how we did in the NICHD study. So, for example, there are teams where they measured things like, the curriculum materials, whether or not there was an office for the staff, and whether or not children's artwork was displayed. I mean, do I think it's important to display children's artwork? Yeah, I do. But what if I were in a center that didn't? It could be really a question of choice. What I think is important are those teachable moments too, and that's why we spent so much time with our clipboards following individual children around centers and homes, looking to see, if they talked, did somebody talk back to them? And were people being harsh to them? Were people teaching them things about, colors and numbers, et cetera, et cetera? So I think we agree.
So we have this great example in the Reggio schools. Do we have any policymakers now who have actually visited, who are themselves trying to push for some kind of a similar change in our system? Well,
Americans aren't the kind of people who try to copy what other countries do. So I don't think it's a model that has influenced early childhood educators. but I don't think particularly a model that has influenced legislators. And neither does the Swedish model, which is also good, or the French model. I mean, there are lots of good models that are available in Europe to us. But yeah, I think it's really an uphill battle because of the political climate that we're in. And, I understand it and am sympathetic to it. I am not here arguing for universal child care. I mean, I think that would really take a solid economic analysis that I haven't done. It's really beyond the purview of my research domain. But as somebody who has done this kind of research and knows the quality matters, what I tend to do is inform policymakers on what my data show to see if they can really use it so that there will be at least programs for the children who are most in need. And those tend to be economically disadvantaged children. So, there are policy efforts underway. There's a group in Massachusetts called Early Education for All that's working on a piece of legislation. I just emailed the director of that, Margaret Blood, today, and I said, where's the legislation? And they're still working on it. I think there's a committed group in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts does better than most states do in terms of supports for poor children, in terms of pre-kindergarten for at least some children. But as I said, it varies widely from state to state. We're living in a time that values states' rights, so I don't expect that to change. There's no child advocate I know of that's even talking about universal child care regulations. That strikes me as a little silly. I don't see why we couldn't agree that 12 babies to one caregiver is too much, but so far that hasn't happened.
Thank you, Kathleen McCartney.
Thank you.
You have been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum, a free public forum in Harvard Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For an audio cassette of this program entitled Why Care About Child Care, featuring Kathleen McCartney, recorded in February 2002, send a check or money order for $12 to Cambridge Forum, 3 Church Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138, or call 617-495-2727, or visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. Thank you for joining us. Next week, Wednesday, February 27th, be here when we host Kennedy School of Government Professor John Ruggie, former Assistant Secretary General and Chief Advisor to United Nations Secretary Kofi Annan, discussing the New World Order. What is the role of the United Nations in a post-September 11th world? We hope to see you. Thank you for coming. If you have a moment to fold one chair, we'd appreciate it.